Today, I am joined by Thomas Panton. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thomas Panton is a speaker and entrepreneur in the environment sector. He's a founder and CEO of shop Greenr, which has recently changed its name to Canopey, I believe, which is a multi-vendor marketplace that quantifies the impact of products on the environment. He's also a former outreach team member at Greenpeace UK, founder of Festovers, and a speaker on sustainability and waste in the events industry, and also a recent convert to Islam. Thomas, thank you very much for coming on. I am really honored to have you here.
No, it's Assalamu alaikum. It's great to be here, and yeah, thanks for inviting me onto the podcast. I appreciate it.
Just we were discussing before about, I think, Islam and the environment, right? So I thought I'd just start off with, because this is something for me. When I was studying about the environment in my master's degree, I was asking, okay, why should I even care about the environment? And I thought to myself, as a Muslim, like, if I take a view that if we're all just atoms, why should we care if most molecules of CO2 are being released, at this current stage of the planet's history? For me, it was inextricably linked to my belief in God. Like, because I believe in God, I have to care. But as a non-believer, I could not see why I should really care that much. But you cared about the environment when you weren't a believer in God, or you probably were, and you're the fan of Greenpeace, and it was really something that concerned you. I just want to know the impetus for that. What made you care so much about the environment?
Yeah, I think you've made some really great points there, and there's a lot to sort of go into and break down. But where it started for me was as a child and growing up. I was sort of surrounded by people who really cared about how we were treating not just the planet but other people as well, and that instilled a lot of those teachings of sort of non-corruption and trust and high principles into me, regardless of religion at that point in my life. My family aren't Muslim, and yet they're not particularly religious, my direct family, yet they continued to instill those principles within me as a child. And then as I grew up and became more sort of independent and began exploring those ideas myself more, I began sort of exploring and investigating those concepts of environmentalism. So I remember watching a film called The Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. And this was released when I was a kid. And I remember just being without much knowledge of the science, right, at that point. I hadn't studied any of this. But just watching that and just on the plain sense of it, being quite shocked at the impact we were having on a natural world which we relied on to live in, without much regard for how that was going to impact future generations, and how it was going to impact us as we grew up. So really, that was really the impetus for me to begin looking more into that. And I went on to study international relations at university in my undergrad. And that's where I really got educated on the instability around the globe, which is often due to resource scarcity, right? And often due to people fighting or disagreeing over land or the resource or energy or whatever it might be. And that often comes down to our use of those resources and our impact and exploitation of the planet. So that really just led me, as I was learning more about it and being more engaged, as you mentioned, I got involved with Greenpeace. So I started working for Greenpeace during my undergrad degree, actually. And originally it was, really very much just fundraising for the organization. I liked what they were doing. I thought that they presented solutions in a really digestible way for governments and corporations. And I wanted to support that. So I applied for a job, got a job, and started working for them. Very quickly began doing outreach and working in their sort of events and speaking team. And that's when you really get involved with the campaigns, right? You really understand the science behind it because you start working with the people who are giving you the evidence and have been learning about this for so long. And I think that a lot of that then defined what I went on to, which I'm sure we'll get into in terms of founding a company and looking at how we can have more of an impact directly on people's lives. When Islam came into all of this was really much later. So I'd graduated my undergraduate degree, and I have always had a sense of spirituality or some sense of an energy that is sort of a higher power, but I haven't been necessarily organized religion before this. And so then I started, hanging around with more people. I actually traveled to Morocco, and the adhan every morning would wake me up, and just the feeling that instills in you as a person is so inspiring. And at first, I put it down to the novelty of being a tourist. And, I thought, oh, this is just a really nice, different culture to me. And I went away thinking that was all it was, but began becoming more educated in Islam. And a lot of the stuff that I believed in terms of environmentalism were reflected in the teachings of the Quran, and in the messages of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I really wanted to then learn more about that and become more ingrained in that religion. And again, we can talk more about that, but everything that I do has come from that feeling that we are created in the same way that the earth has been created, and therefore we have a responsibility, a moral obligation to treat that earth in the same way that we would expect to be treated as an individual, which is with respect. So therefore we take that into everything that we do, and as a business owner, that is then implemented across everything that I do within my businesses as well.
Wonderful. And let's build on that about the business and Greenpeace. So on Greenpeace, I was active in volunteering, right? And now you started as a founder. What have you learned from both experiences? And in lieu of that, do you see how, in the sense that how is it different being a founder compared to being an activist? I suppose there's a skin in the game aspect, like there's more at risk. But do you see, as one is now, you're actually contributing, or did you see you contributing as before as well?
Absolutely. I think there's activism definitely has a place in society and in the environmental movement, but only if it's productive and leads to solutions and change, right? So Greenpeace is great at that, because as much as I was employed by them as a fundraiser and I was getting involved voluntarily as an activist, the way that they're presenting those arguments are targeted specifically at governments and corporations. And instead of just shouting and complaining, they are making people aware of fundamental issues within those models which are damaging the environment or taking advantage of people in other countries and other places with less regulation. And then they present a solution to how we can move past that. How can we transition away from the current model where we're exploiting Earth and people, and move towards a situation where we're working with that economy and with those people and with those societies around the world and with the planet as well. I think, unfortunately, there are plenty other activist organizations which don't do that. They just shout, right? And what that leads to is that people view all of these organizations with the same scope, which is just simply not true. Some of them are less proactive than others. And I think that Greenpeace for me has been one of those organizations, and perhaps this is because I know more about the organization and how they work, but they're one of those organizations which presents solutions rather than just complaining. And I think that's really a really important point, which is why it relates so well to me being a founder, right? Because mostly I learned that as much as we as individuals might care theoretically about what's happening with the climate, or people, often individuals are far more responsive and act on those intents to be better if they've actually experienced the impacts themselves, right? And this is just because we must always consider the convenience of the world that we've built and how we can sort of tie convenience with sustainable solutions or with ethical solutions. And they always have to be in tandem, because you can't have one without the other. Otherwise, they just won't be adopted by the individual. So for me, when I went from being a employee and activist and sort of volunteer for an environmental non-governmental organization, they're not for profits, they're there as an independent, completely funded by individuals, they don't take money from any businesses, to then going into the private industry where I'm funded by investors who are in it for the money. They might understand the mission, but there's a real drive to make profit. It has been learning how to navigate that sort of and bring that same understanding that people ultimately want the convenience of the lives that they now are used to living, but we have to scientifically and religiously, we have to bring those drives and those aims into a sort of better impact scenario, and ultimately that has been a great learning curve, because I've worked with the big corporations, I've worked with the governments, and now as a startup, I'm in this super dynamic and moldable position where we can actually learn and create the type of business that we want to create, which is still for profit, which is still making an impact on the economy and jobs and all of these great things, but also sticks to the foundations of what we're building, which is more ethical and more sustainable overall.
Would you see yourself as would you see as a natural progression that you start off with activism, maybe when you're younger and so on, when you've got the energy and you just don't know what really to do, and eventually the right thing to do is actually become a founder or have more skin in the game in that sense? Because there's a book by Nicholas Nassim Taleb, not sure if you've heard of him, but he says when young people come to him and he asks for advice, he says you give them 3 pieces of advice. The first is don't virtue signal. The second, don't rent seek. And the third, start a business, because you've got there's an element of risk that you have now. And because you have that element of risk, you're going to make wise decisions.
Yeah, I think ultimately there's a place for both, and I really don't think that. I think you can be an activist, or you can be someone who works for an organization which uses activism without needing to own the company, but still understand the impact that has wider than just the act of being an activist, right? So, to put that into a bit more context, I think that there are lots of people who definitely shouldn't be business owners, and that's not an insult to them. I just think that running a company or starting a startup is a very specific set of skills and a specific set of drives and ambitions, and ultimately that's not going to suit everybody. No one can be the same, right? We're all built differently. We're given free will. And that means, therefore, that the individual then has to choose what is going to make most sense for them. For some people, that means being involved with those organizations. I know people who have worked for Greenpeace for decades now, and they do fantastic work. They've made great change. They've got organizations like huge global banks to change their policies, or governments around the world to put regulation in so that we're not damaging rainforests or oceans or fish levels in the sea, whatever it might be. Those things are because those people work best in that world, in that scenario. However, there definitely shouldn't be a split, because currently what happens with the climate movement is we sort of shun business. And actually, that's the wrong attitude to have, because we do live in a capitalist economy. We do live in a world where money ultimately is important and growth is important as well. And I think that in order to make the most out of the climate movement, we definitely need to see more collaboration between it. But I don't think we should see everyone moving towards business. I think you need both. The main reason for that is that it holds you to account as a business owner, or as a CEO, or whatever your position is in that company. If you've got organizations which are independent from you and don't have any responsibility to the economy other than making sure that we stick to our ethics, it means that as a business, you are unable to cut the corners, and you're unable to therefore go backwards, because we've been moving forwards and progressing with the way that businesses should and could run in a more ethical world. And without the sort of third-party independence to hold you to account, you lose that. And then the ability of free markets capitalism completely overruns. So therefore, you need both. And I think that it just depends on the type of person you are. For me, I would still consider myself part of that group with Greenpeace. I still donate. I still give to charities which are fundamentally putting pressure on companies and governments to be more sustainable. But at the same time, as a business owner, I'm fundamentally aware of the impact that businesses also need to have. And I think you can have both, but I don't think you should have, just one society of one type of organization.
Sorry for cutting off there.
Okay, we're back.
Okay. So when you're younger, Thomas, did you have a Marxist attitude? Or because when I was younger, I certainly had that inclination, especially when studying at university. And how had your perspective changed since your earlier days?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think that there's a lot of great principles that come out of other sort of political and economic systems. We live in a capitalist world, and that's not going to change anytime soon. However, that doesn't mean that we can't scrutinize it. and we can't look for ways to improve it, whether that's in business or whether that's in wider society or wider economic policy. So I think that, yeah, when I was at university, I was pretty active in sort of looking at other solutions. I wrote my dissertation on democratic confederalism, which is a whole sort of economic policy and system which is written by Abdullah Öcalan from based in northern Syria, or Rojava. And I was really inspired by the ways that they were looking at different ways in which society could work. So breaking down the sort of patriarchal barriers and looking at ways in which it didn't have to be run on the concept of rich and poor, or someone gets richer at the same time someone loses money. It could be based on the trade of goods and all these other things. However, as I've sort of progressed through my journey and my career, and as much as ideologically these things might be great to theorize and great to scrutinize, you have to take a piece of realism about what is actually possible. And often when you look at things just through that lens, you become hindered for progress because you can't relate to the world that we actually live in. So for me, as I've progressed and gone through my career, and definitely as I've become a startup founder, I've just been more aware of the way that society works and the way that you have to work within that in order to make change. And often that doesn't necessarily mean losing those thoughts or losing that ideological perspective, but how that can be applied to what you're doing. So, good examples of this are looking at the way that businesses can be more ethical in a capitalist society. So whether that's being fairer to your employees and having more of an equal basis of decision making, less of a hierarchical structure, and more understanding for others in society, or even if that is how you work from an economic perspective, where do your profits go? How are those profits distributed? All of those different things challenge the system we live in without expecting the entire economic system to change, right? And I think that's the difference, is that when I was younger, it was all about how can we change the entire system? How can we take it down? How can we break it? And now it's much more like, well, how can we improve it? How can we live within it and allow everyone to benefit from that society, rather than just sort of talking from this sort of ideological perspective, which is unachievable, right?
Yeah, there's definitely benefits of being exposed to those critical techniques or critical perspectives, like Marxism, for instance. Like if you read Marx and he talks about commodification, now when you're a business owner, you can say, look, I'm not going to create fictitious commodities. I'm going to trade real stuff. That's actually better for the planet.
Exactly that. I think this is the thing, is that when you're talking on a theoretical level or an ideological level, it's very easy to sort of apply those theories to the entirety of society, but often there are niches within that, there are verticals within that from business perspective, which don't necessarily fit into that pigeonhole of theory. And this is the difference a lot of the time with sort of every type of critical perspective, is that theory is very different from the actual sort of reality of implementing these things. So we can theorize all we want, but until we start acting upon it and actually making those changes, that's when you start to realize how they are applicable. And I bring this back to my work with Greenpeace, in that Greenpeace aren't expecting the big companies and big governments of the world to disappear and to denounce capitalism and just like change the world. What they're doing is saying, look, this is you. We know that you work in a profitable and a capitalist economy, and these are the solutions which allow you to continue to be profitable and continue to grow, but without exploiting people and planet. So we're not asking you to sacrifice your entire business. We're just expecting you to work on a more ethical lens and a more ethical basis. And I think that's the very much the difference between theory and practice, is that once you start applying these things, it doesn't mean changing the entire system. It just means looking for a lens of things can improve, and I can make them improve by doing whatever it is you want to implement.
Yeah, and part of the environmental cause is that we're not against profit at all. It's about not destroying the planet, which is the very thing which allows us to profit.
Yeah, exactly that.
Mitigating that short-term selfish thinking and saying, look, we want everyone to profit, long-term generation as well.
I think this is, I mean, you've made a really good point. It's just like environmentalism is like long-term capitalist thinking, right? We're not here saying everything needs to stop. what we're saying is that in the current state of things, you are going to destroy your business. So instead of thinking like that, how about you implement these policies and you implement these thought processes which have more of a care for planet? Your business will then survive longer and you'll make more profit, as well as the people who work for you. That is a benefit to society, but it needs to take into account the environmental impact that you have as a company or a government or whatever it might be.
Exactly. If you want your nation to prosper, your people to prosper, just don't destroy the environment.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly that.
Um, Moving on, I want to ask you about how you keep yourself in check as a founder, because as we see with capitalism, it's very easy to be greedy. And let's say we're the example of certain industries like mining, and they use there's a number of human rights abuses in the supply chain, and they use child labor because they can reduce their costs.
Yep.
And if no one's going to punish you for that, then people can get away with it. Then they might as well do it, especially if they don't hold themselves to a higher power, right?
100%.
How do you prevent yourself from veering down that path and keeping yourself in check?
So I think there's two fundamental things. There's one from like a business perspective, and then there's one from a personal perspective. So personally, there's I sort of take into account all the business stuff, but ultimately I know that the way that I act and the deeds that I make throughout my life will be judged at some point, right? Because I believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, when we come to that day and I'm weighing up all the acts that I've made, I want to make sure that I'm doing what I can to make sure that I don't, be perceived as more bad deeds than good deeds, right? Essentially, is in simple form without going into all of the scripture. But essentially, I think that from a wider level, for people who aren't Muslim, is that we can confidently say that the world is changing. So whether that is employees rejecting or quitting their jobs from companies with bad ethics or sustainability practices, or businesses are being pickier about who they work with. I mean, for example, we have an accountancy and we made sure that we were checking their entire supply chain to make sure that they were an ethical accountancy. And this is something which is growing more and more, right? And then at the same time as all of that, consumers and individuals are demanding more transparency, and efficacy within business. So all of these things lead you as a company to ultimately just make good business decision. So as much as in the past and for hundreds of years, well, in all of human history, essentially, it's all been about that sort of growth at all costs. So that could mean exploiting various different things from human rights to the environment. I think we're in a really great position now where that isn't going to fly anymore. And actually, we're seeing a drastic shift quite rapidly in the way that people are viewing the way that companies should work. So if you as a company want to survive and you still want to get business, you still want to get partnerships, and you still want to have people who want to work for you, then you begin to have to take those things into account. And that means that you have to hold yourself accountable. I think also there's a whole piece here just on the fact that new regulation comes in all the time. So just generally throughout history, we've seen a progress in regulatory policy. Sometimes that isn't always correct. Sometimes it goes too far. But generally, particularly sort of recently in the UK, for example, the Competition and Markets Authority have really clamped down on greenwashing. So the practice of companies saying that something is sustainable when it isn't, that would be greenwashing. And now we're seeing more regulation and policy that is clamping down on those sorts of things. So as much as we can see consumers demanding it, as much as we might see that employees might not want to work for us, ultimately, the way that a company changes is if they have to. And what we're seeing now is that shift begin to happen. And interestingly, going back a bit, that comes from pressure from external organizations. So working with places like Greenpeace or supporting organizations like Greenpeace has led to these things. And arguably, we wouldn't be in such a progressive place. And this isn't a global thing. I'm very aware of that there needs to be more efforts for global cooperation on these things, I think, without the disregard of cultural differences, because that's often a thing which often gets disregarded as well. And I think that's a really sensitive place to balance. But generally, I think there should be more global cooperation, because then that will allow the entire world to be in a much more sustainable place, not just environmentally, but also economically.
Great. And I think my next question was going to be about scaling, but I think you touched on that, but I'll ask it in a different way then. do you think ethical business can scale as effectively as, let's say, businesses like Amazon and so on, who aren't the most ethical in the way they treat their workers? Because they exploit their workers and underpay them, that has allowed them to be massively profitable and destroy the competition, and they can just buy out anyone who competes against them.
Yeah.
So do you think ethical businesses can scale?
Now, yes. Even a decade ago, probably less so. But I think more and more we're starting to see just like clear evidence that that has to change. And it doesn't mean that those companies will disappear again. Like Amazon aren't going to stop being a company in a decade, but they will have to drastically change the way that they work, mainly because of policy and regulation changes, but also because of consumer demand. For example, in the UK, a third of consumers regret when they've made a purchase on Amazon, mainly because they know of the human rights abuses that are happening in their warehouses, and because of their environmental impact and their tax avoidance and whatever else it is. And I think that because of that pressure, and because there are companies which are offering real alternatives like Canopy, for example, is that now we're beginning to see a world where consumers can actually have an impact on the demands that they're making. So whether that is asking the company to be more ethical or sustainable, or if that is looking at all the alternatives to that company in the first place. So I think yes, but I also, there's a slight caveat to that, which is that as much as I'd love to say that that's absolutely happening right now, I don't think it is quite there. So I think we're still going to go for a transitionary period where we're still going to see companies, particularly in problematic industries like oil and gas or mining, where they will really try and rinse as much profit as they can before they have to change, right? And that's just something that we're going to have to I think is going to be very difficult to stop. So therefore, all we can do as individuals and businesses and governments and other companies is just keep putting that pressure on and keep moving forward. And then eventually those companies are going to be left behind. I would hope that that happens sooner rather than later. But, realistically, I think there will be this transitionary period where companies can continue to exploit. And it will be a few years before that just can't happen anymore, basically.
And could you tell us a bit about Canopy? Because you mentioned the company there, and I'm sure
Yeah.
about who they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I realized we haven't really dug that much into what my company actually does. But essentially, Canopy is building your home for buying better. So the whole concept behind what we were doing was that you shouldn't have to be an eco warrior, and you shouldn't have to be an activist, and you shouldn't have to be a climate scientist in order to make better purchasing or living choices, right? So the whole concept is that you can live your life the way that you want, how you want, when you want, but in a much more sustainable way. So initially, what we've built is a marketplace online, but also a impact calculator. So we not only bring and verify the claims of brands and the products that they sell to make sure that they are more ethical and more sustainable for the planet and people, but also we then actually use data like real life cycle analysis, scientific data from universities around the world to show you as a consumer how much carbon emissions, how much water waste, how much plastic waste you're saving when you buy that product compared to its mainstream alternative. We're really early stage company, so we actually launched this year, which is really exciting. We've just raised capital investment, and that's a good point, right? Like, so we're an ethical company, and we still raise money. We're still for profit. We're still looking to build a profitable company and a big company, right? We want to be the global home for buying better. The difference is that everything that we've done has built into the foundations, walking the walk of ethics rather than just talking about it. And I think that this really resonates with consumers because consumers are beginning to want to see that from companies, but also they're sort of changing their purchasing habits because of it as well, which works well for us, obviously, as a company, but also we're doing that to help those decisions anyway. So yeah, anyway, we've built all our platform, we've built the tech, and we go live in a couple of months, which is quite daunting, but also very exciting. And hopefully it goes well, inshallah.
Okay, that sounds really wonderful.
Thanks, man.
Wait for it.
Yeah,
When you say
appreciate that.
a couple of months, is that after Ramadan?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like during, which is going to be really interesting because
Well,
obviously,
you could do a campaign for ethical e-gifts.
Well, yeah, definitely, right. I mean, I think it will be during our beta launch, which is when Ramadan takes place, which means that anyone who is sort of in our community already, so sign up to our email list, because that would include people who have done that, would be part of that beta launch, and that means that we're able to give you sustainable and ethical and thoughtful gifts for Eid and Raya, for when that time comes. But inshallah, we all have a really great Ramadan first, because it's such a great month, and really excited for it.
And you said you're based in Norwich, right? I want
Yeah,
to venture more into what made you convert to Islam, because you told us
yeah.
about eco-environmentalism. You studied environment at University of East Anglia, I believe.
Yeah, so I did international relations at University of East Anglia, which is based in Norwich. That's when I moved to Norwich, because I'm originally from Oxfordshire, actually, and I now am also doing a master's in climate change and international development as well. So I've just like consistently kept that academic learning. But yeah, the reversion to Islam was honestly the most fulfilling decision of my life, and I think I'm always talking about this to people, because it's been a journey of a decade, but it's been quite a recent reversion. So just to give you some context to that, I've sort of always, and I think I've mentioned this earlier, I've always had this sort of spiritual or feeling of like a higher being, but I haven't been raised in a particularly religious household. Like my grandma is Catholic, my parents aren't religious, and they have never pushed us like on into religion, so it hasn't ever really been something that I've even really thought about. In fact, growing up, I was probably sort of like, oh no, I'm never going to be an organized religion, right? But I always felt something like it was undeniable. And then as I sort of went through university, obviously started connecting with different people as well. So there's a great Muslim community here, which is really nice, and I met a lot of friends who and still have those friends who are part of the community here, and we share Ramadan together and all of these great things. But I learned a lot from these people. And then a decade ago,
Yes,
I
Norwich. Sorry to interject. Is it
yeah
in Norwich, the Ihsan Mosque, right?
yeah
Is
yeah yeah. So that's one of the mosques right in the city centre. And then there's also we've well we've converted or occupied one of the university buildings and turned it into the sort of the university masjid, which is really great for students because it gives you somewhere on campus, because it's a little bit away from the city centre. So instead of having to travel, like we all just congregate here for prayer, and particularly during Ramadan, it's great because not just the university students but also the local community will come to that same place for breaking a fast or for Fajr prayer or whatever it might be, which is really great. But anyway, so I to give some context into my background, when I was a teenager, I was a national swimmer, a sports person. So this was before the business world, before the environmentalism, and I that had sort of been what I thought I was always going to do. But I got injured quite badly, and it meant that I had to stop, which was quite a big change in my life. But when I stopped, all my friends growing up in the UK and being a white Western man, they'd all been partying, and I hadn't been, because I'd been swimming to an international level, right? So I wasn't really meant to at that time. I was meant to be focusing on my health and on my sport. And I spent about a year partying, like getting into it, and very very quickly realized that I really didn't like it, and that something just felt inherently wrong about poisoning my body, basically. And actually, ironically, when I turned 18, 2 months later, um, I quit everything. So I've been teetotal without taking any toxic substance into my body for a decade before I even touched Islam. So there were a number of things that I was already doing which really resonated with me when I came to Islam. So I was conscious of my food, how it was raised, how it was grown. I'd experienced that party culture, but very quickly came out of that and had been teetotal for a decade. I already had that connection with the higher power, and then went on to understand that as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think that so there's a lot that happened during this time, but to keep it short, I visited Morocco, and I went there just as a tourist and heard Adhan, and just like every morning was just like elated, this feeling of just like absolute elation, and always put it down to the novelty of being a tourist. I think I was telling you earlier, and then yeah, when I left, I just consistently kept learning, and then about 2 years ago, I reconnected with a friend who was Muslim, and we started hanging out more, and learning more again. I'd gone on a surf trip with him to Morocco a few years back again as a second trip, and we'd learned a lot more. I'd learned a lot more about Islam, and I then went and just started practicing. So I practiced my first Ramadan. I did the entire fast of Ramadan without actually taking Shahada at that point. So it was, I just wanted to go and experience that that journey, that religious journey, and understand what it was about. And I mean, from that point on, I was a practicing Muslim. And then in June last year, I took Shahada, and Alhamdulillah, it's been, I can't, it's really hard to put into words, as you can probably see, but and you'll know this, but it is just the most fulfilling experience, to believe in and to have come to that position to this point. It resonates with everything that I do as an individual. So I'm really happy to be here.
How's your experience been from going from a state of obviously not being Muslim, then praying 5 times a day?
Yeah.
Like that's a big ask,
It's, yeah, very different. And I think, look, if realistically that's had been a journey in itself, right? Like, I don't think, as much as a lot of Muslims, we're all meant to do that. I think that we're all learning to do it more, right? And we're always looking back and going, oh, I didn't do it enough, and now I'll start again. And I think that for me, it was a journey getting into that routine. But I think one thing that was really, really helped with that was starting a company, because you then have to structure your day. Like I have to be strict with myself to get stuff done. I have to be strict with myself to achieve the KPIs or whatever the targets are that I've put in place for the business. Well, I just calendar in prayer. Like, as lame as that sounds, like it's just part of that business. It's part of that calendar day. It's part of that, that journey. And I think that it really helps that I've co-founded the organization with, he's a non-Muslim, but he is so willing to understand and learn that there's been never any sort of pushback against that. So for Fridays, there's never any question that I'm going to be away for the majority of the day at the mosque. Like, it's just, that's what I do. And that's what we're meant to do. So it's been, yeah, definitely a learning curve. I think the biggest sort of, not roadblock, but the biggest sort of challenge as a white Westerner, who grew up in a non-Muslim community. I didn't know any Muslims as a teenager at all. Like, in the area that I lived in, Oxfordshire, it was a white community. Like, there was very, very little multiculturalism. And then when I came to Norwich, like, Norfolk is even less multicultural. So it was, that just never, and luckily it was at a university, so you do meet more people, but even then it was pretty minor. I think that all of my previous sort of friendship groups and communities and relationships that I've built, have had to go through that test of me turning around and being like, well, I'm Muslim now, or and saying that proudly, but not necessarily getting a proud reaction back. And I think that when I speak to the brothers at the masjid, I explain that it's really great going to the mosque because everyone understands there, right? But as soon as I speak to, I'll give you an example. I was at a networking event for my business, and I explained that, one, I wasn't drinking because I don't drink, but also because I'm Muslim, and secondly, that I needed to leave for prayer. And there was a guy who I've known for years who didn't know that I'd reverted to Islam, and he didn't say anything bad that you could see in his reaction, there was a like a hesitancy, you know, and it was just like, there doesn't need to be that.
Yeah.
You know, I'm still me. You know, and Islam isn't what the Western media portray it to be, and it is just quite saddening sometimes to see the reactions of some people when you tell them. But you know, I think that's what pretty much all Muslims experience anyway. So I'm certainly not saying this is unique to me.
No, that's okay. That's quite interesting. I want to ask about, because obviously you've been involved in the environment for over a decade now,
Yeah.
doing the work. How has your faith impacted that, and has your perspective changed on anything about nature, or your perspective of nature, and how to interact with it, or has it reinforced something that you kind of already knew was there?
Yeah, I think definitely just reinforced that entire belief system. I think the most noticeable is with the food that I eat. So I have fluctuated between different diets throughout my life. So I was vegetarian, then I was not at all, and then I was vegan. And however, throughout all of that, I've always had a deep sense of um, treating animals with respect, essentially, and that comes from my dad. You know, he works in sort of land management, or like volunteers in land management in his spare time, and I think that because of that understanding of the way that different biodiversity works and interacts with each other, and the way that animals are raised and not exploited, has really resonated with me. So then when I came to Islam and started learning more about halal, and this gets me, right, because most people understand halal as the way that an animal is killed, and the prayer that is said when it's done. But that's not
as well. Yeah.
It's the whole process. It's the raising of that animal. It's the entire life cycle of God's creation, to the point where it becomes a meal for you, and you sort of then ingest that, and then it goes back, and it's that whole process, that whole circular movement. And I think that people don't understand that. So then when I learned about that as someone who also didn't know that, I was so pleasantly surprised that halal food was actually exactly what I believed in. The difference is that we also bless that to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think that you know, that's fine, because that's something that I believe in, right? So, you know, I think that generally my journey with Islam and environmentalism have been so interchanged and interlinked. And particularly as I now practice as a practicing Muslim, it's just something which is second nature to the work that I do, whether that is on speaking on a stage at a conference, or whether that is running my company, or whether that's working for Greenpeace, you know, or being on a podcast. Ultimately, all of that comes back to, one, the belief that we're human. There will come a point where we are judged for the way that we act, and the way that and whether we have followed the pillars of Islam. And on the other side of that, the understanding that the world is interconnected, and actually it's all God's creation. And as much as things might develop, and we might learn more about the science behind that, like, don't get me wrong, I'm certainly not anti-science and progress in understanding that, but you know, the fundamental belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this, and the stories that come down from that, all of that understanding pushed into the understanding of treating humans and nature with the same respect that we should be expecting ourselves. You know, it is all interchanged, and I'm really thankful and grateful that has been the experience that I've had.
That's great. That's good to hear. Want to ask something now. Climate anxiety is like a big thing that's in the news now. We see a lot of articles on the BBC, especially young people feeling climate anxiety. Did you ever feel that before? And what's been your experience with that before Muslim and after Muslim?
Very interesting. I was talking about this today with my co-founder. So my experience with climate anxiety, I think, look, it's a new buzzword generally. I think people are always anxious about something. And I think that this just happens to be a crisis, like a climate crisis, that we're more aware of as more knowledge comes out. However, there's also a fundamental belief that, you know, what's meant to happen will happen. And, you know, that is not always something that we can control, but with the free will that we've been given by God, we can use that to be better and to treat things better, right? So I think my experience with that is that I never really felt climate anxious, not in that phrase. Like, I was aware that things needed to change. I was aware that we should be treating, Allah's creations better. But this was even before Islam, so just treating the world better and people better. I'm a very empathetic person, so I really, feel what other people are feeling, and particularly with countries which experience the climate crisis sooner than us, which is pretty much every country, because the UK won't experience it for a long time. I'm very aware of that and very conscious of the fact that we're in a very privileged position here to talk about it. But as I've learned more about the climate and become a climate scientist through my studies and academically, and working alongside people who have spent decades studying the climate, I wouldn't say that I've become climate anxious, but I've become fundamentally aware of the urgency. However, this is tied with the fact that I believe in the writings in the Quran, and I believe in the scripture of Muhammad, peace be upon him, and come down from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think that it's a difficult balance, because I think that there's an urgency that we need to work harder to change things, but I'm also resolute and peaceful in my understanding that what will happen, and if that's how it was meant to be, that's how it was meant to be, and that if judgment day comes when judgment day comes, that's just what was planned, right? Yeah. That doesn't mean that we should become complacent, though, and I think this is the difference for a lot of Muslims. And I'm certainly not judging, I have no place to judge as another person, but I see across sort of our community, well, this is meant to happen, so therefore it doesn't matter. And that's not strictly true. We have free will. So if we see something which is having a negative impact on God's creation, we have a moral obligation to therefore make a choice to better it. If that then still ends in Judgment Day, so be it. But at least we can look back and know that we've done everything we thought we should, or that we can, with God's writings to do the best for the planet and the species that live within it. So I think for me, the climate anxiety is tied with an understanding of we will be judged for the actions we make. And I think that the earth and all its creatures within it were creations in the same way we were creations. So therefore we have a responsibility to do what we can to make that more sustainable. And then if we get to Judgment Day, and I think I always ask the question, okay, what's the worst that can happen if I'm wrong, right? Yeah. Like, if I'm wrong that the climate crisis isn't real, then all I've done is given you a better society to live in. You have free, unlimited energy. You have products which don't waste and create horrible trash on the side of the road. You have people who are prosperous and living happily without being exploited. Okay, the climate might still do the same thing, but that is better. That is a better thing than where we currently are. So even if the climate crisis, it is real, scientifically, it's unequivocally impacted by humans. But if we get to Judgment Day and, God wills that it was meant to happen, at least I know that I've been talking about things which will improve people's lives. And that is still God's will, compared to just talking about the environment, if that makes sense. Sorry, I went on a bit of a rant there.
That makes sense. Yeah, there's a scholar called Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad from Cambridge. Okay. A while ago, in one of his something he wrote, he said, "History is in the best of hands," which is for me the answer to the climate crisis, or the climate anxiety. Sorry, that whatever happens, God's in control.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter, whether we're relieved that our responsibility. Like, if God wants to save the planet and do whatever He wants, He can do it. Yeah. But He's left us to kind of figure our way out and say, you guys will be judged according to what you do.
Exactly. And I think that's exactly it. Is we were created different from angels, right? We were created with free will so that we would have the choice to look at the way that things work and to make decisions based on those choices. And I think that as much as the statement that it's in God's hands is correct, absolutely. But we are God's hands, right? Like, we have been created to do good, to follow scripture, to follow the work that has been written in the Quran. And I think that therefore everything that is said in the Quran is about that same concept of making sure that the planet is treated well, and that we're not toxic, putting toxic in our body, or we're not treating other humans with corruption and taking advantage of them, and all of these different things. And I think that if you just go to the basic scripture, right? If you just go basic right back to what is written in the Quran, then you become an environmentalist, like, fundamentally, because you're not necessarily even thinking about, I need to save the planet. You're just following what Allah has willed. And that therefore means that you're making choices which are good for all of Allah's creations, right? And I think that is the fundamental difference. And then once we get to the point of Judgment Day, sure, what's happened has happened. And that was God's will. And then we are judged on what decisions we made. If we ignored the Quran and we decided that we knew better with our free will, and we decided that actually, no, like, it's all in God's hands, like, we don't need to do anything, that's problematic, because it means fundamentally we're not following scripture. So
Yeah.
this is the important connection between environmentalism and the Quran, is that as much as we might want to disagree with it, in the Quran it talks about being stewards of the earth. So therefore to be a good Muslim, we must do that. We must follow that writing, and we must be stewards of the earth and of all God's creations. So that, at least that's my understanding of it.
Yeah, and also repeatedly in the Quran, it mentions the idea of people striving for God's cause. And what is God's cause? That is to spread goodness. And part of goodness is to stop corruption.
Exactly, right. So it all comes back to the same. And that's what I loved, and that's what really resonated with me with the Quran and with the teachings of Islam, is that it's all fundamentally about being good, like, and being merciful and being understanding and empathetic. And yes, there are things which are written that are choices for us, that we follow, and that will ultimately be different from what other people believe if they're not Muslim. But at the end of the day, for us as Muslims, we read what is being declared in the Quran, and then we are the stewards of that scripture. And ultimately that always comes back to being stewards of the earth, but also to being good. As much as simple as that sounds, and there'll be a lot of people who don't like the simplicity of it, but it is really important that we don't overcomplicate a lot of, because I think what can happen with interpretation is that we really try and read into it. What does this mean? Well, it's telling you that we are against corruption, so therefore we are good people. That's as simple as it needs to be. And if you follow that, then you're doing good deeds. And then those good deeds will be judged on you on Judgment Day, alhamdulillah, and then, this is a good thing. So there doesn't need to be any more complication than that. And that's what I really liked about the simplicity of understanding the Quran and Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Thank you. I think that's a good note to end on. We don't want to take more of your time.
I appreciate it.
Thomas, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Hamza.